Hey everyone, and welcome back to Build UX. In this episode, we're going to establish the main layout of our page and then begin on the article content. With where we left off last time, we got our global header finished out with the main menu and the global search form as well. Now it's time to turn our attention to the article and a side layout that we have. Looking at our designs, we have consistent spacing values for gutters in our main layout. So you can see that we have 128 pixel gutters on both the left and right edge, as well as between the aside and the article. On mobile, this goes down to a single column layout where we have the article above the aside. To get started with this, let's make sure we have a class on our main element that wraps the article and aside elements. So let's put a class in here of main. That'll be our block name here. And then in our app.css, let's go all the way down to the bottom of our file. And we'll establish a new section with a dedicated comment. So we'll say main, class of main. And we know that as a start, we'll at least have two different layouts. So on mobile first, we'll have a single column layout. And then on desktop, we'll have this side-by-side layout. So let's make sure we get those carved out with media queries. We'll say max width of 575 pixels. Our main element is just going to be really straightforward. The aside already follows the article content in terms of the DOM order for mobile, so we can just add our padding as needed. So to grab our padding values, let's inspect our mobile mockup here. And it looks like we just used that 16 pixel space default. So we can say our padding right is going to be space default, and then the same thing for our left padding as well. Give that a quick save. Shouldn't be too much of a difference here if we inspect our mobile view. We have our column established here. It's already in the correct order. So for the main layout, we want to focus now on the larger than 575 breakpoint. And at this breakpoint, this is where we'll want to feel out where we should go from a side-by-side layout to the single column. So we'll have to kind of play around with the viewport and figure out what feels most comfortable for the content that we have. After we get the internal contents of each of these sections established, that'll really help us to finalize these, but for now we can just put in our best guess. So let's assume that above 575 is immediately where we want to go to this top layout, and then we can add any necessary tweaks as we go through the different viewport sizes. So let's just say as a start that at a min width of 576 pixels, we're going to target our main element. And here I think it'd be a handy use of grid. So let's say that display grid is going to come into play. And one thing I really like with grid is just to use grid template areas to kind of verbally describe our layout that we're going for. So in the case of this design, if we're looking at the main content areas handling both the article and aside, we really only have one row. So we can say that there will be a gutter, then we'll have our aside, another gutter, our article, and a final gutter there. Let's make sure we have the syntax correctly here. Unknown property, oh, this is supposed to be singular, grid template areas. And now that we've described the areas themselves, let's define their actual columns. So grid template columns. And in this case, we know that our gutters are going to be 128. Then for the aside, on desktop, we go to a max width of 360. On mobile, we don't really need to bother with that, but let's just get it hard-coded at 360 for now. So we'll say 36 rems. We'll repeat that same gutter. Then for the article, we just want it to take up whatever remaining space is available. So we'll say that's set to 1 fractional unit proportionally. And then we'll finish it off with that exact same amount for the right gutter. Now, if we give this a save, one thing that we'll have to do before we can check up on it is assign both the article and aside to these grid areas. So let's just draft out sections for each of those components. So we'll have our article, we'll just call it article in terms of the class name, and we'll say grid template or grid area actually is going to be article with no quotes. And then following that, we'll have our aside. Similar structure here. Grid area is going to be set to aside, and that should take care of things there. Let's make sure that we add these classes to their corresponding elements. So this is our article, and then down here is our aside. All right, now that we've saved that, we can see this layout is starting to take effect immediately, and we can already tell that this is going to be way too tight for this specific breakpoint. So a couple things that we want to change is once we do bring these in to be side by side, which obviously needs to happen at a larger breakpoint, let's probably start off with the aside going down to a minimum width and then having more of a flexible layout from there. So looking at our mobile mockup, at 320, this goes down to a min width of 288. Let's say that that's actually the min value that this can go to. So let's say min max, 28.8 rems, and then the max will be that 36 rems. So what this will do is allow this left column as needed to be flexible in terms of its layout. You can see that it tries to accommodate the article section once it comes into play by taking advantage of that min-max situation. So one thing we want to get a sense of is at what point we have enough room really for that article to come into play. And it looks like that'll probably happen, honestly, around 1200 pixels. Before that, we might just want to stick with a single column layout, and we may do a little bit of responsive design within the aside itself and the article to have things reflow. But it looks like in terms of these large chunks of our layout, that's probably the best breakpoint to go off of for now. Once we get everything styled, we can always come back and refine this decision, but let's just give it a go right now. So we'll say 1199 pixels is our single column layout, and then here it'll be 1200 pixels. So below 1200 pixels, this feels like a lot more appropriate breathing room around these elements. Let's make sure we can grab our window here. And then once we go above 1200, that seems like kind of the minimum use case for having this two column layout. And that'll get us up to our desktop layout that we see here. So that's really it for the main layout. Let's turn our attention to drafting out some of the initial styles for our article. One thing we can probably get a good bit of progress on is adding the type specs that we'll need for each of these elements, since most of the content within the article is obviously typography. So in our index.html, let's find our article. We have our h1 as the article title, and let's just double check what we used as the type specs for these various elements. So in our article body, we have display. So we'll add a class of tDisplay, which should be responsive because of the CSS we put in originally. Next up, we have blackberries. This is actually going to be tcopy large, I believe. Yep. And then our body copy is just tbody. So for each of these paragraph elements, I'm just holding Alt or Option, and we can say tbody is the class name on those. Next up, our nutrition information. I believe this is why we created the tbody fluid class, because on mobile, these go from 16 pixels to 14, I believe. Yep, so it looks like these all need tcopy fluid, and then this will be tcopy large for the share call to action. Let me undo that accidental spaces I added. On each of these list elements, again, holding Alt or Option, let's say class is going to be tcopy fluid. I believe that's what we called it. Let's double check that. Make sure it renders as expected. Yep, that's looking correct. And then share this article. It's going to have a class of tcopy large. Lastly, these will be our social sharing buttons that we built out in our menu section. So we might want to refactor some of those classes, but we'll take care of those in just a minute here. All right, things are shaping up in terms of the typography. Obviously, you can see we might need some intermediary responsive sizes because things are looking pretty massive, even at this 1200 breakpoint. So now that we have things starting to get into a good context, we're getting a lot closer to understanding the overall layout and responsive design that we're going for. A couple of things I'm noticing is we have a couple hidden text elements, so we might as well get those out of the way while we're at it. So nutrition information is a hidden title, and then share this article. This article additionally is going to be screen reader only content. So we can take out this content, paste it in there, and we'll actually want the space to be hidden visually. So that way it'll just show the word share. And now that we're looking at our type specs here, it seems like the line height on our body type spec is a little small if we compare it to our designs. Maybe that's intentional. Let's just double check. I guess that is what we're looking for. 14 pixel font size, 18 pixel line height. Let's just check that real quick with T-body. Yeah, and that seems to be correct. Okay, so we might tweak that in the end because it looks a little bit tight, but that is based off the design that we're seeing so far. Now, to help get more context on how things are going to shape up, it may make sense to start going through some of these smaller elements and getting them styled up as we want. And that'll just help us establish the remaining context we need to finish out the responsive design for the overall layout of the page. So blackberries as a subheading has this little decorative element 16 pixels away from it. It's a 36 by 2 decorative element. So let's call this article. We'll call it the section heading, since we do have these 20 types of berries and we have the section selector below. In our app.css, let's go all the way back down to our article styles. Create a new block here. And the way we're going to handle this is, since it's a very simple shape, we can probably just create it using a pseudo element. So we can actually back this up and say the after element in this case is going to have empty content. We know its width is 3.6 rems and its height is 0.2 rems. And its background color in this case is going to be charcoal 21. And we probably need to set its display to inline block. That way it can take the width and height properties. So inline block. All right, that's looking good. We'll want to make sure that these are vertically aligned center. And we also need the margin left of space default on this. It's looking good. So on the article heading itself, our section heading, I should say, let's set this to be display flex, and we'll align items center. And that should bring it vertically in line with the typography here. Cool, that's looking good. A couple of things I'm noticing is we need to bring in our default colors for a lot of these elements. So the article heading itself will have a color of charcoal 21. While we're at it, let's get the styles for the heading itself in place. This will just be article heading. You know, we'll have that same color. And it looks like there's some default margins here. So let's inspect this. For now, let's set this to be margin 0 because we may use a grid layout to handle the overall spacing within the article. But for now, we're just getting things established. Let's apply this class of article heading to our T-display. So article heading. It's looking good. Things are tightened up a little further. As I mentioned, this font size is way too big for this breakpoint. So we can adjust that as well. This is coming from the T-display class. At 575, we had it at 3.2 rems, and then at 576, we had it go up to 8 rems. So let's add an in-between media query. Right now we're looking at around 1200 pixels, and that still seems like it's way too large. So this is going to start out at that min width of 576 pixels. And then let's take a guess here. Let's say like maybe a max width of 1399 pixels. And for T display, we'll copy this out. And one thing we can do that's really cool in Firefox now is open up this panel for fonts and actually kind of prototype on the fly the different parameters we have for our typography. So we can bring the size down until it's looking good. I think 5.6 is nice in terms of rems. So let's get that in place. And then let's just pick, let's say a pixel based, just so we can keep it nice and clean numbers now. Let's say, how does 64 look in increments of 8? I think that looks good. We might even be able to get away with going lower, maybe a line height of 1. Let's see if that's too tight. I actually don't mind that, so we might just stick with that. So let's say the line height on this is going to stay at just 1 for this size. Let's compare to our designs to make sure it has the same kind of airy feel to it. I think we probably do want to actually go up to that 64 pixels just to keep it visually consistent with what we're seeing here. So 64 pixels, let's pull up our calculator and we'll say 64 divided by 56, so 1.143. Cool, that feels a little bit better. Now, right now we have an override happening because our min width is at 576. So let's make sure this goes up to 1400 pixels. And now our responsive design should work as expected. Let's refresh to make sure everything is the way we'd expect. So you can see at our mobile breakpoint, kind of our in-between tablet breakpoint, which is looking nice. And then if we go really wide with this, that's where we get up to this super large scale layout, which should have enough room on a big enough screen to handle that. But we can always tweak this further. So we'll reset our responsive design mode just so we can continue on with the basic styles of the article. Let's get our article body copy styled up here. So I'm going to scroll all the way to the bottom. We'll say article body. And this will actually be an element of the article block. Let's set its color to be that lighter gray and get it applied to each of these paragraph tags here. So holding Control or Command D, select these 3 paragraphs, move in here. We already have class, so we don't need to type that. We can just say article body, give that a save. That's looking good. Cool, let's continue on with the rest of our typography. So we have this nutrition information. We'll just focus on some simple styles for now. And the first thing we can do is actually clean up the list styling here. So we'll give it a class of nutrition items. And then each of these list items, let's give a class of nutrition item. Scrolling down, still within the article, we can put in another section comment for nutrition information. And say our nutrition items are not going to have any padding or margin as a start. And we'll also want to take off that list style as well. Let's make sure our spelling is correct. Nutrition. That's looking good. Now, within each of these nutrition details, we'll need to provide one color for the label and another color for the value that we find with each. So by default, let's apply on our nutrition item the color of our base charcoal, 21. And then within this, let's maybe do a modifier class and say that this is nutrition item value and give this a color of that lighter secondary gray that we have, color charcoal 46. This would actually be an element within item since it's nested inside. So let's just adjust that and get those classes applied. Nutrition item. So we have to say around each of these values, we'll want to select the values themselves and give them a span with a class of nutrition item value. Grab the contents that we're looking for, cut them out, paste them inside, and then let's get our formatting cleaned up here. So we'll grab our span, let's break this to a new line, and break our closing tag for our list element to a new line. Lastly, we will get the labels on a new line themselves, and things are looking good there. Cool, let's just carry on. At this stage, we were working on the global layout for the article and aside, but I think it's really helpful to just get these basic styles carved out, and then we'll dive into each section in more detail, as well as finalize our responsive design. So just like our global header, we kind of went back and forth between different elements to keep getting more context around what we were building. And this is another good example of that. Because we're affecting the overall layout of the page as a whole, we have to kind of go through and iteratively build up individual elements of the page. So that way we can kind of see how much spacing we want around different elements, and also to get things a little more polished up before we dive into finalized styles for each component. Continuing on with this design, let's just get our share section with the social media buttons wired up here. And this will largely reference what we did for our global menu. So we may want to refactor those styles to be standalone, similar to what we did with the button icon itself. Taking a look in our HTML file here, let's go back up to the social section within our menu. This is actually going to have all identical layout to the share section. So instead of menu socials, this will be a really easy refactor. Let's just take out the word menu, and that'll allow us to reuse this as a standalone component. So we'll save it here. That'll break our styles. So let's find menu socials. We'll rename things here as well. So we'll take off the menu prefix on these three. We're going to cut this and bring it into its own section called social. Paste that in. And now what we've done is create a reusable component with a good namespace that we can immediately apply to our share section as well. So here, let's say that this section itself actually is going to have a class of social. That should be plural in this case for the layout that we're looking for. Give that a save. Looking good. We can actually copy out the SVGs here. So I'm just going to copy both links and we'll adapt them as needed. Okay, so we'll paste those in. The only real difference here is we were a little more verbose in our link text here for sharing. So we said share on Facebook and share on Twitter. We can get rid of these placeholders, give that one more save. Things are shaping up here. I think the last thing is for our CTA, we have a class of social CTA, and this can be an element of the social block instead of a suffix there. Looking good. We'll have to update the class accordingly here, and then make sure we do the same in our menu. So let's find social CTA and make sure that follows the same BIM naming syntax there. Cool. That's a good basic style for what we have going on here. Let's move on to our related articles and section selector. So scrolling down in our index.html file, let's find our related article section. Both this and the below section are going to have screen reader only titles. So I'll take care of those. Next up, we won't be tackling the card styles of these links just yet, but we can at least apply their typography class. So if we drill into the aside featured articles and grab our title, looks like we have the T title class. So let's apply that to both of these anchor tags, T title. give that a save. And then lastly, I think our section number has its own class. And here we provided hidden text for screen readers. So we will want to selectively style these elements. First off, we have a span with class of screen reader only, and that is going to surround all of this preliminary text. Paste that in. Directly around the O3, we're going to say a span of T section number as the class. Expand that out. Our 3 will go inside of there. And then lastly, let's just copy this over. We have another span of hidden text around the rest of that sentence. So if we styled that correctly, we should just see the large 3 there. While we're at it, let's just get these buttons styled up to be icon buttons instead. So if you recall, all we need to do for that is bring in a class of button icon. And you're starting to see here how the reusability of these classes really comes into play. And you can imagine if we were building more than one page, if we were building dozens or hundreds of pages, we've really created a consistent design system and a set of components that are going to be highly reusable throughout our application. Let's put our hidden button label text inside of the screen reader only class, and then we'll bring in our icons that we need. So in our assets folder under icons, it looks like we're going to have the left icon and right icon for the caret. And let's just double check what we need here. It looks like they'll probably be the larger versions that we have, 12 by 24 or so. Let me check the actual finalized assets we created. It'll be the right large and left large variations. So we know we want left large. We can copy that out. And if we go back down to our article selector, this will be go to the previous section, so we'll want it here. This will be a class of button icon, and our role of presentation as always. When we don't want it to be exposed to screen readers. Next up, we have a very similar setup for our following button. So let's just copy a lot out. We can replace this with the word next, get our formatting cleaned up, as well as our indentation, a class of button icon, and our SVG, which will be right large. Copy that out. Paste it in, get our button icon class in there, and role of presentation. And if everything's all right, we should see our buttons behave as expected. They already have the correct tap target sizes and focus states, which is great. And that's a really good first pass on the contents of our main layout. So with that in place, let's see how we feel overall about these breakpoints. I think this will serve us well. I think we can keep the overarching breakpoints of our grid layout the way they are, and we can always refine this in the future if we see fit. So if we take a look back at our design, in the next episode, we'll finalize the styles within the article layout and then see if we can move on to our side. And with those two things established, we'll actually be getting pretty close to finishing out this project. So thanks again for watching, and check out the next episode for some more styling of the article section and seeing how far we can get with that.